Okay, so picture this. It's 1983, you're cruising down the highway, wind in your hair, but you're not in some fancy convertible. You're on a motorcycle. And not just any motorcycle, one with a word on the side that just screams speed and power. Turbocharger.
Yeah, back then turbochargers were pretty exotic. People were used to seeing them on race cars, not something you'd find on your everyday ride.
Right. It was like something out of science fiction.
Hmm.
But Honda, they've always been about pushing boundaries. They decided to take that turbo tech and put it on two wheels. And that's what today's deep dive is all about. The 1983 Honda CX650 Turbo.
And this wasn't just some marketing ploy, to sell a few extra bikes. Honda was dealing with a real challenge back then. How do you make a motorcycle that's both powerful and fuel efficient? Remember, this was the era of the oil prices. Gas prices were a big deal for everyone.
It wasn't just a selling point, it was a necessity. So how did they do it? Well, we've got some awesome sources to dig into. We've got the original sales brochure, of course. Gotta love those 80s brochures.
Pure gold.
We've also got a road test from Cycle Test magazine. They actually put the CX650 Turbo head-to-head against its rivals. No holding back.
And to really understand how this thing worked under the hood, we cracked open the original shop manual. Don't worry, I'll spare you the super technical stuff, but it's fascinating to see how they brought it all together.
Oh, and I almost forgot. We've got a quote from the legendary Cycle World writer, Charles Everitt. This guy could make a bicycle sound exciting, so just wait till you hear what he has to say about a turbocharged Honda.
His writing is amazing, really captures the feeling of riding these machines.
So, let's set the stage here. It's 1983. Turbochargers on motorcycles were about as common as, I don't know, a phone with a built-in camera.
Right. Totally unheard of.
Honda had just dipped their toes in the turbocharged waters the year before with the CX500 Turbo.
Which, was a cool bike in its own right, but it definitely had its quirks.
And Honda, being Honda, they took those quirks as a challenge. They weren't content with just dipping their toes in. They wanted to dive headfirst into the turbocharged future. And the brochure, well, let's just say they weren't afraid to make some bold claims. Rewriting history was one that caught my eye.
Bold for sure. But they were trying to hit that sweet spot, performance and fuel efficiency. Those were the magic words back then.
Exactly. So the big question is, did they pull it off? Well, that's what we're here to find out. And that Cycle Test review is going to give us a crucial outside perspective. These guys, they weren't afraid to tell it like it is. Good or bad.
Oh, yeah. They put it through its paces.
They'll give us the real deal on how this turbocharged beast handled out on the open road. All right, so we've talked about how Honda is aiming for the moon with this turbocharged motorcycle. But how about we actually get under the hood, so to speak? What's the secret sauce? What makes this turbocharged engine tick?
Well, it all starts with a turbine, right?
Okay, like a jet engine.
Yeah. It's funny you should say that. The shop manual actually uses that very analogy.
No way. Really?
Yep. It's all about harnessing energy that would normally be lost. See, a turbocharger uses the hot exhaust gases, which would typically just get expelled, to spin a turbine. That turbine is connected to another turbine, and that one forces more air into the engine. More air means a bigger explosion, which means more power.
So you're essentially giving the engine a supercharger or a bigger lung or something to help it breathe better.
Exactly. But there's a catch. Early turbochargers, they had this nasty habit called turbo lag. Basically, you hit the gas and nothing.
Oh.
Yeah, and then suddenly, bam! It's like you hit the afterburners. Not exactly ideal for smooth riding.
Especially on a motorcycle. You need, precision and predictability.
You got it. That's where Honda's engineers really earned their stripes. They knew they couldn't completely eliminate turbo lag with the technology back then, so they focused on making it, well, less terrible.
How'd they do that?
First, they gave the engine a serious growth spurt. The CX650 Turbo boasts a 674cc V-twin engine, a big jump from the 500cc engine in the CX500 Turbo.
So bigger engine equals more power off the line.
You know it. But they didn't stop there. They also cranked up the compression ratio.
Hold on. Back up a sec. What's compression ratio again?
Good question. So the compression ratio is basically a measure of how much the air-fuel mixture gets squeezed, compressed inside the cylinder before it ignites.
Okay, and why does that matter?
Well, imagine this. You're trying to light a pile of loose gunpowder versus a tightly packed one. Which one's going to give you a bigger bang?
Right, the tightly packed one.
Exactly. The higher the compression, the more efficiently you can burn that fuel, the more power you get out of each explosion.
Interesting. So they made the engine bigger and more efficient. But what about actually controlling all that turbocharged power? That seems like a recipe for disaster.
That's where things get really slick. They used a computerized fuel injection system.
Fancy.
For 1983, this was cutting-edge stuff. Most bikes were still using carburetors back then. This system could monitor everything, like the engine speed, how much you were twisting the throttle, even the boost from the turbo. And then it would use that information to figure out how much fuel to inject at any given moment.
Like a digital brain for the engine?
Precisely. And get this, it even had a self-diagnosis feature. So if any of the sensors detected a problem, warning lights would pop up on the dashboard.
Wow, talk about ahead of its time. Okay, so we've geeked out on the engine enough. Let's talk about what it was actually like to ride this turbocharged beast. Did it live up to the hype? Okay, so we've popped the hood on this turbocharged time capsule. We've talked about the dreams, the engineering, the ambition. But let's be honest, what we really want to know is what it felt like to actually ride this thing. Did it live up to the hype?
Well, the guys over at Cycle Test, they said it was like, how did they put it? Oh yeah, a Jekyll and Hyde personality.
Interesting. Okay, I'm intrigued. How so?
So at low speeds, just cruising around town, they said it was actually pretty tame, almost boring even.
Wait, really? That's not exactly the turbocharged thrill ride I was picturing.
You see, that's the thing about turbos. It's all about building boost, right? So at low RPMs, when you're not really pushing the engine, it's almost like the turbo isn't even there.
Ah, so it was hiding its true nature, biding its time.
Exactly. But then you hit a certain point in the rev range, the turbo spools up, and hold on to your hats.
Because Dr. Jekyll just turned into Mr. Hyde.
Something like that. Cycle Test described the mid-range acceleration as, and I quote, simply astonishing.
Okay, so it could move. What about compared to the other bikes at the time?
I blew them away. Remember that roll-on acceleration test we talked about?
Yeah.
Where they pitted the CX650 Turbo against the Suzuki GS1100?
Yeah, the GS1100. That was like the super bike of the day, right?
The king.
Yeah.
And the CX650 Turbo smoked it, left in the dust. Just goes to show you what a difference that turbocharger made.
Wow. Okay, that's impressive. But all that power, I gotta imagine, wasn't exactly easy to handle. Especially for riders who are used to, a more analog experience.
You're telling me. Cycle Test, they even admitted that the power delivery, while smoother than the CX500 Turbo, it still took some getting used to. This wasn't a bike for beginners.
I bet. So what you're saying is this was a bike that demanded respect.
Absolutely. But when you got it right, when you timed that boost just perfectly, it was pure magic.
I can only imagine.
And that brings us to our friend Charles Everitt. Remember that Cycle World quote I mentioned?
Oh, yeah, laid on me.
All right, so he said riding the CX650 Turbo was like, and I quote, strapping yourself to the Millennium Falcon and punching it into hyperspace.
Man, that's poetry right there. He really had a way with words.
The best. And it wasn't just about the speed, it was the whole experience, that feeling of raw power, that sense of pushing the limits.
Yeah, he captured that perfectly. Okay, so we've got a bike that's turning heads, breaking records, and drawing comparisons to spaceships. Sounds like a recipe for success, right? Did it sell well? Did Honda start a turbocharged revolution?
Well, that's the funny thing. The CX650 Turbo, for all its brilliance, it wasn't a huge commercial hit.
Really? Why not? It sounds like they nailed it.
It was a bit ahead of its time, maybe, expensive, complex. And that turbo lag, even though they tamed it, it still made for a pretty demanding ride.
So too much, too soon.
Perhaps. Or maybe it was just a bike for a specific type of rider, someone who craved that edge, that challenge. But even though it wasn't a massive sales success, it proved something important. It proved that turbocharging had a place in the future of motorcycling.
Interesting. So a glimpse into the future, but maybe not the future everyone was ready for.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating, isn't it? We get to look back at these moments in time where innovation and, let's be honest, a little bit of crazy, collided to create something truly unique.
Absolutely. And for those listening, it makes you wonder, what's the CX650 Turbo of today? What's the piece of technology that seems impossible, too good to be true, but maybe, just maybe, is a sign of things to come?
Good question. Something to think about, right?
Definitely. Well, on that note, I think we've done our turbocharged due diligence for today. Thanks to everyone for joining us for another deep dive. Until next time, keep the rubber side down and those engines revving.